On the night of June 9, 1912, the small, peaceful town of Villisca, Iowa, became the site of one of the most chilling and brutal murders in American history. What began as an ordinary evening for the Moore family ended in unimaginable horror. The quiet town, which had known little of violent crime, would never be the same again. The Moore family consisted of Josiah, known as Joe, a respected businessman and former mayor of Villisca, his wife, Sarah, and their 4 children: Herman, 11, Mary, 10, Arthur, 7, and Paul, 5. That night, they had invited 2 young girls from the neighborhood, Lena and Ina Stillinger, to sleep over at their home. The 2 girls, ages 8 and 12, were the daughters of a local family who lived just a few blocks away. After attending church services earlier in the evening, the Moore family, along with the Stillinger girls, returned to their home around 9:30 p.m. The house was modest but cozy, with a wraparound porch and a small front yard. They all settled in for a night of rest, unaware that a terrifying and brutal fate awaited them. Around midnight, a figure dressed in dark clothing entered the Moore home through an unlocked door. Armed with an axe, the killer crept silently through the house. The brutal violence that followed has been seared into the minds of those who have ever heard the story, though no one can truly comprehend the level of horror that occurred in those few, terrifying moments. The killer first struck Josiah Moore. With a single blow, the axe struck his skull, crushing his head. Then, the killer moved on to Sarah, who lay beside him in bed. A similar fate awaited her. The killer didn't stop there. One by one, each of the Moore children and the 2 young girls were violently murdered in their sleep. Each victim's skull was crushed in a savage, calculated manner. The killer didn't leave immediately after committing these heinous acts. In fact, the murderer seems to have taken his time. After finishing with the family, the killer allegedly moved around the house, setting a series of disturbing touches to the crime scene. A bloody handprint was left on the wall and ceiling, suggesting the killer may have moved the bodies or stood over them, reveling in the carnage. The axe itself was left behind, embedded in the skull of one of the victims. But perhaps the most unsettling detail was that the murderer covered the faces of the victims with bedclothes, an eerie final touch that made the scene even more disturbing. The killer didn't leave right away. It's believed that after the murders, the killer stayed in the house, possibly even sleeping in one of the Moore children's beds. Some reports suggest that the murderer ate a meal in the kitchen and washed his hands in the sink, leaving behind a half-eaten plate of food. This strange act of normalcy in the midst of such brutality has fueled theories that the killer may have been someone familiar with the house or the family. The next morning, neighbors grew worried when they saw that the Moore family had not emerged from the house as they usually did. One of the neighbors, Mary Peckham, went to the house and knocked on the door. When there was no answer, she called on a local man named Ross Moore, who was a relative of Josiah, to help. Ross entered the home and discovered the grisly scene. The bodies of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls lay motionless in their beds, their faces obscured by the bedclothes. Authorities were immediately called, and the town was thrown into shock. The brutality of the murders stunned everyone. As law enforcement investigated, they found few clues. There was no sign of forced entry, and the windows and doors had been locked from the inside. There were no signs of struggle, suggesting that the victims were caught off guard and perhaps even knew the killer. A search of the house revealed some disturbing details. Despite the axe being left behind at the scene, the killer had cleaned up after himself. The killer's footprints were found outside the house, but they led nowhere of consequence. There were no obvious clues to the identity of the killer, and despite the violent nature of the crime, no clear motive was ever discovered. The investigation led to several theories and suspects. One of the prime suspects was a man named Frank Jones, a wealthy businessman in Villisca who had a known rivalry with Josiah Moore. However, despite the mounting tension between the 2 men, there was no concrete evidence linking Jones to the murders. Other theories suggested that the killer may have been a transient or someone with a history of violence, but no definitive proof could be found. In the years following the murders, several people were accused and investigated, but none were ever charged or convicted. One theory suggested that the killer may have been a psychotic drifter who had targeted the family at random, Another idea proposed that the murders were part of a series of similar killings that took place around the same time. But none of these theories provided any solid answers. To this day, the Villisca Axe murders remain unsolved. The town of Villisca, once a quiet and peaceful place, became infamous for the brutality that occurred within its borders. The Moore House, where the murders took place, still stands and has become a popular tourist attraction for those interested in the macabre and paranormal. Visitors often report strange occurrences, such as unexplained noises and ghostly sightings. Many believe the spirits of the murdered family and the Stillinger girls still haunt the home, forever trapped in the place where their lives were violently taken from them. Though the case remains a mystery, the Villisca Axe murders continue to captivate the public's imagination. The chilling details of the crime, the lack of any resolution, and the eerie atmosphere that surrounds the town have made it one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in American history.